The late September afternoon cast golden light through the stained glass windows of St. Bartholomew's Church as the villagers of Little Wickham gathered for their annual Harvest Festival service. Miss Jane Marple sat in her customary pew near the back, her mild blue eyes taking in the familiar faces around her while her knitting needles moved with practiced rhythm. The ancient church smelled of beeswax and chrysanthemums, creating an atmosphere of peaceful reverence that had comforted generations of parishioners. Reverend Timothy Ashworth stood at the pulpit, his earnest face glowing with satisfaction as he surveyed his congregation. At 42, he was still considered the new vicar after 3 years in Little Wickham. But his genuine care for his flock had won over even the most traditional villagers. Behind him, the ornate lectern displayed the parish's most treasured possession, the Wickham Bible. Bound in ancient leather and gifted to the church in 1847, its brass clasps gleaming in the afternoon light. Miss Marple observed the usual cast of village characters with quiet interest. Mrs. Dolly Bantry adjusted her elaborate hat while whispering to Colonel Melchett about the church roof fund. Dr. Haydock sat stiffly, clearly wishing he were anywhere else, while the village postmistress, Miss Weatherby, clutched her handbag as if it contained state secrets. Young Peter Clement, the church organist, appeared unusually pale, and his wife Sally twisted her wedding ring nervously. Even Mrs. Hester Pike, the village's most notorious gossip, seemed subdued as she sat alone in the front pew. "Let us now turn to our reading from the Book of Ruth," announced Reverend Ashworth, stepping toward the lectern with ceremonial gravity. "Mrs. Pike has graciously offered to read today's passage." Mrs. Pike rose with evident pride, her gray hair perfectly coiffed beneath a new hat. She approached the lectern with the measured steps of someone savoring a moment of public attention. Miss Marple noticed how the woman's gloved hands trembled slightly as she reached for the ancient Bible. The scream that pierced the church's tranquility was unlike anything the peaceful village had ever heard. Mrs. Pike stood frozen at the lectern, one hand pointing at the open Bible, the other pressed to her throat in horror. The beautiful illuminated pages were defiled with dark, dried stains that could only be blood. Crimson droplets had splattered across the sacred text, and the blue silk ribbon marker was torn and stained. "Dear God," whispered Reverend Ashworth, rushing forward. But Mrs. Pike's horrified gaze had shifted beyond the Bible to something behind the lectern. There, crumpled against the stone wall, lay the body of Mr. Clifton Vale, the village's antique dealer. His head bore a terrible wound, and his right hand was stained with blood, the same blood that had defiled the holy book. The congregation erupted into chaos. Colonel Melchett barked orders while Dr. Haydock pushed forward to examine the body. Mrs. Bantry fanned herself dramatically, and several villagers began talking at once. Miss Marple remained seated, her knitting forgotten in her lap as she observed the scene with sharp attention. She noticed how Peter Clement's face had gone from pale to ashen, how Sally Clement's nervous ring-twisting had intensified, and how Miss Weatherby seemed more interested in the Bible than the body. Most intriguingly, she observed that Mrs. Pike's horror appeared genuine, but there was something else in her expression, a flicker of recognition, perhaps, or fear. As Reverend Ashworth gently closed the blood-stained Bible and the village constable was summoned, Miss Marple reflected that peaceful Little Wickham had just revealed its darker nature. Someone had committed murder in God's house and deliberately defiled the sacred text. The question was not merely who, but why someone would choose such dramatic symbolism for their crime. The afternoon sun continued to shine through the stained glass, but its light now illuminated a scene of death and desecration that would haunt Little Wickham for years to come. The shock that had frozen the congregation began to thaw into a buzz of horrified speculation as Constable Pierce, red-faced from his hurried bicycle ride, took charge with the flustered authority of a man unaccustomed to serious crime. Within 20 minutes, Inspector Slack arrived from Much Benham, his sharp features set in lines of professional irritation at being summoned on a Sunday afternoon. "Nobody leaves until I've had a word with each of you," Inspector Slack announced, his voice cutting through the nervous chatter. "This church is now a crime scene." He surveyed the congregation with the suspicious gaze of a man who had learned to trust no one's initial protestations of innocence. Dr. Haydock approached the inspector with his preliminary findings. "The poor fellow's been dead for several hours, I'd estimate. Sometime in the early morning, perhaps around dawn. The wound was made by something heavy and blunt, a candlestick perhaps, or a stone." This information sent a fresh ripple of whispers through the gathered villagers. Miss Marple, settling herself more comfortably in her pew with the resignation of someone who recognized she would be there for some time, observed the various reactions with quiet interest. Peter Clement's already pale complexion seemed to drain of what little color remained, while his wife Sally gripped his arm with white-knuckled intensity. "But Inspector," interrupted Mrs. Pike, having recovered enough to find her voice, "how did Mr. Vale get into the church? Reverend Ashworth locked it after evening service yesterday. I saw him do it myself when I delivered the chrysanthemums." Reverend Ashworth nodded, his hands still bearing faint stains from where he had closed the bloodied Bible. "That's quite correct. I locked the church at 6 o'clock yesterday evening. The only other person, the key, is Peter, as our organist." All eyes turned to the young man, who seemed to shrink under the scrutiny. "I didn't come to the church last night," he said quickly. His voice pitched higher than usual. "Sally and I were home all evening." "That's right," Sally added, her voice trembling. "We had dinner and went to bed early. We were together the whole time." Inspector Slack made a note with evident skepticism. "We'll verify that, Mr. Clement. Now, what can anyone tell me about this Vale fellow? What was his business with the church?" Mrs. Bantry, having recovered from her initial shock, was eager to contribute. "He was an antique dealer, Inspector. Came here from London about 6 months ago, bought the old mill house. Kept rather odd hours, I noticed. Always poking about, examining old things with that magnifying glass of his. He was here yesterday evening," Reverend Ashworth added reluctantly. "He had proposed organizing an exhibition of ecclesiastical items to raise funds for our roof repairs. I showed him the vestry chest, the old chalices, and alms dishes. He seemed particularly interested in their provenance." Miss Weatherby, the postmistress, suddenly spoke up, her voice crisp with self-importance. "If you want to know about Mr. Vale's recent activities, Inspector, I can tell you he posted a registered packet yesterday afternoon. Foreign stamps, very expensive, addressed to a London solicitor." "Which solicitor?" Inspector Slack asked sharply. Miss Weatherby hesitated, realizing she had perhaps revealed more than discretion warranted. "I keep records for the postal audit," she said defensively. "Hartwell and Associates, Lincoln's Inn." This information caused Sally Clement to lean toward her husband, whispering urgently. Miss Marple, blessed with the unassuming ability to overhear conversations not intended for her ears, caught fragments. "The account, and, he promised, and something that sounded distinctly like distress. So there's money at the root of it," Colonel Melchett pronounced, with the satisfaction of a man who believed all mysteries ultimately reduced to pounds and pence. "Not always, Colonel," Miss Marple said gently, her knitting needles resuming their quiet rhythm. "Sometimes it's pride that proves more dangerous than poverty, or fear of exposure." Inspector Slack looked around the ancient church, taking in the blood-stained lectern and the nervous faces surrounding him. "Right then. I'll want formal statements from everyone. And I'll need to examine that Bible properly." He paused, his gaze lingering on each potential suspect. Someone in this village wanted Clifton Vale dead badly enough to kill him in God's house and defile a sacred book. I intend to find out who and why. The formal questioning began in the cramped stone vestry, where Inspector Slack had commandeered the ancient oak table, spreading his notebook across its scarred surface. The blood-stained Bible lay wrapped in brown paper beside him, awaiting transport to the police laboratory, though Miss Marple suspected it would yield few secrets beyond what they already knew. "Right then, Reverend," Slack began briskly, "you mentioned that only you and Mr. Clement have keys to this church. Let's see them." Reverend Ashworth produced his key ring with trembling fingers, pointing to the heavy iron key. "The west door key, Inspector. The vestry has its own entrance as well." He gestured toward a nail on the wall, where two keys hung side by side. "The vestry spare should hang there, but—" His voice trailed off as they all stared at the empty third hook. Slack's eyes sharpened. "When did you last see that key?" "Yesterday evening, when I locked up. I'm certain it was there." The vicar's distress was evident. Only Peter and I knew of its location. Miss Marple, who had quietly followed them into the vestry, noticed the faint arc of scuffed dust leading from the door toward the chancel. Inspector Slack crouched to examine it, his expression grim. "Drag marks," he announced. "Your Mr. Vale didn't die where we found him." "Dr." Haydock nodded grimly. "Would explain the blood pooling. The poor fellow was moved after death." Peter Clement was called in next, his face pale as parchment. When asked about his key, his hand went reflexively to his pocket before stopping abruptly. "I haven't it with me," he said too quickly. "Where is it?" Slack demanded. Sally Clement, who had been hovering anxiously outside, suddenly appeared in the doorway. "He mislaid it a few days ago," she said breathlessly. "He meant to tell the Reverend, but he did not." Slack finished coldly, making a note. Miss Marple observed this little tableau with interest, the protective wife offering explanation before her husband found words, the husband stiff with shame at being shielded. It seldom meant guilt of the worst sort, but it nearly always meant trouble of some kind. The questioning continued, and gradually a disturbing picture emerged. Miss Weatherby, called in with her postmistress's attention to detail, revealed that Vale had been sending registered packets monthly to the same London solicitor for 3 months. "Always marked private and confidential," she reported with professional precision. "And yesterday, he seemed particularly agitated when posting the latest one, said something about finalizing matters and leaving no loose ends." Dr. Haydock, when his turn came, added another troubling dimension. "Vale had been asking pointed questions about local families, Inspector, medical histories, genealogies, who had lived where and when. Said it was for his antique research, but there was something unsavory about his curiosity. I suspected he might be one of those blackmailers who prey on small communities." This revelation sent a chill through the vestry. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused as she absorbed the implications. A blackmailer would certainly have enemies, and the monthly packet suggested a systematic operation rather than a casual hobby. Mrs. Pike, when finally called for questioning, appeared more composed than anyone had seen her since discovering the body. But Miss Marple noticed how she avoided looking directly at Peter Clement, and how her hands trembled slightly when Inspector Slack asked about her recent interactions with the deceased. "I barely knew the man," Mrs. Pike declared firmly. "Certainly never had any business with him." But Miss Weatherby, still present from her earlier questioning, cleared her throat delicately. "Forgive me, Mrs. Pike, but I did see you speaking with Mr. Vale yesterday morning outside the post office. You seemed quite animated in your discussion." The color drained from Mrs. Pike's face, and for a moment the vestry fell silent except for the scratch of Inspector Slack's pencil. Miss Marple noted how Peter Clement's knuckles whitened as he gripped his chair, and how Sally's protective instincts seemed to intensify, though whether for her husband or someone else entirely remained to be seen. The web of secrets that held Little Wickham together was beginning to unravel, and Miss Marple suspected they had only glimpsed the surface of what lay beneath. Mrs. Pike's carefully maintained composure crumbled under Miss Weatherby's pointed observation, her hands smoothing her gloves with nervous repetition. "Well, yes," she admitted reluctantly. "I did encounter Mr. Vale yesterday morning, but it was hardly consequential. He was asking impertinent questions about village families, their histories, their connections. I told him quite firmly that I wasn't the appropriate person for such inquiries." Inspector Slack leaned forward, his pen poised with predatory attention. "What sort of questions, Mrs. Pike?" Before she could answer, Dr. Haydock cleared his throat meaningfully. "Perhaps I should mention, Inspector, that Vale had acquired the late Mrs. Thornley's papers when he purchased the mill house. Quite an extensive collection: birth certificates, marriage records, old wills, correspondence going back generations. Mrs. Thornley was something of a local historian, kept meticulous records of every family in Little Wickham, including their irregularities." The word hung in the air like an accusation. Miss Marple noticed how several people shifted uncomfortably, as if each were mentally cataloguing their own family's potential vulnerabilities. A systematic blackmailer with access to a century of village secrets would have had his pick of victims. "That would explain the monthly packets to London," Miss Weatherby added with professional precision, "always marked private and confidential. And yesterday he seemed particularly agitated when posting the latest one." Mrs. Bantry, who had been ministering to the more distressed parishioners with glasses of water, suddenly spoke up with characteristic directness. "Since we're collecting inconvenient truths, Inspector, I should mention that I was up at 6:30 this morning, feeding Tibbles. I distinctly heard the organ just a few bars of 'Abide with Me,' only the refrain. I assumed Peter was having an early practice. The effect was electric. Peter Clement's already pale face went ashen, while Sally's protective grip on his arm tightened visibly. Reverend Ashworth looked stricken. "But the church was locked," he said weakly. "Then someone with a key played a hymn while a corpse lay in this church." Inspector Slack observed coldly, his gaze fixing on Peter. "The missing vestry key, your own mislaid key, and now evidence you were here at dawn. What do you say to that, Mr. Clement?" Peter's voice emerged as barely more than a whisper. "I wasn't here. I swear I wasn't. The organ blower is temperamental, only I know how to coax it properly. If someone did play, it would have been very quiet. Just a few notes." Miss Marple observed this exchange with quiet interest, her knitting needles resuming their gentle rhythm. She had noticed the faint arc of sandy grit near the lectern, swept aside as if by a sleeve, and the delicate yellow pollen from the chrysanthemums clinging to the torn blue ribbon. Small details, but in her experience, the smallest discrepancies often held the most significant truths. Sally stepped forward defensively. "Peter had some difficulties with his previous employment in London, a misunderstanding about finances. Nothing criminal, Inspector. Just enough to make us want a fresh start. If Mr. Vale was threatening to expose that." "Ah," Inspector Slack said with satisfaction, "so he was blackmailing you." "We never paid him anything," Sally protested, but her voice carried the desperate edge of someone whose world was crumbling. Mrs. Pike, perhaps sensing an opportunity to deflect attention, added with renewed confidence, "He was particularly interested in the Clement family history. Inspector, something about Peter's grandfather, I believe." Peter flinched, as if struck, but remained silent. His silence, more than any protestation, seemed to confirm the inspector's suspicions. As Inspector Slack prepared to make what appeared to be an arrest, Miss Marple rose quietly, her joints protesting with their usual candor. She drifted toward the lectern, ostensibly to admire the harvest arrangements, but her keen eyes took in the torn silk ribbon lying near the base of the stone steps. "It's curious," she murmured to no one in particular, "how often people make a great show of pointing our attention one way when they're frightened of something in quite the opposite direction." Sally Clement flinched as though struck, while above them all, the captured fragment of a hymn seemed to linger in the ancient rafters, holding secrets of its own. Inspector Slack's pen hovered uncertainly over his notebook as Miss Marple's gentle observation settled over the vestry like morning mist. Before he could respond, Sally Clement's composure finally cracked entirely. "You're all so determined to blame Peter," she burst out, her voice echoing off the ancient stones, "but none of you are asking the right question: why kill Mr. Vale in God's house and then defile the Bible? What kind of person makes such a theatrical display of murder? Her outburst created an uncomfortable silence, broken only by the distant laughter of village children in the churchyard. Miss Marple bent to examine the torn blue ribbon more closely, her movements appearing casual but purposeful. The silk was of fine quality, she noted, stained not only with blood but bearing traces of yellow pollen from the chrysanthemums and what appeared to be candle wax, despite the church's electric lighting. Haydock cleared his throat thoughtfully. Mrs. Clement raises a valid point about the symbolism. The positioning of the body, the blood on the sacred text. It suggests someone wanted to make a statement, not merely commit murder. Or create maximum confusion, Colonel Melkett added with military precision. Draw attention from the real motive. Constable Pierce reappeared from his search of the transept, holding a brass candlestick wrapped in linen. Sir, this was on the vestry washstand, polished to a shine. There's a fresh nick on the base that could match the wound. Inspector Slack examined the weapon grimly. Heavy enough, and suspiciously clean, almost too clean. People do polish things when they're frightened, Miss Marple observed mildly, straightening with the ribbon in her gloved hand. The way a child tidies a broken ornament, hoping to hide the damage. Mrs. Pike, who had been unusually quiet since her earlier discomfort, suddenly spoke with renewed authority. If we're discussing Mr. Vale's inquiries, Inspector, you should know he'd been asking pointed questions about the church's financial records, particularly interested in anonymous donations and whether we maintained records of individual contributors. Reverend Ashworth looked genuinely bewildered. Our accounts are perfectly transparent. We publish annual reports, nevertheless. Mrs. Pike continued, her confidence returning. He seemed to think our records might reveal something significant about certain families' circumstances. Miss Marple examined the ribbon in her palm, noting how its edges appeared torn but showed the clean cuts of sharp scissors beneath the deliberate fraying. Someone had taken considerable care to create an impression of violence while exercising remarkable control. The parish registers, she said gently to Reverend Ashworth. Were they among the items you showed Mr. Vale yesterday? The vicar colored deeply. He asked to see them for historical research. This morning I found the marriages volume left open on the vestry table, though I was certain I'd locked it away. Inspector Slack's attention sharpened. He retrieved the calf-bound book, noting a dog-eared page near the turn of the century and faint brown smears along the margin. He was researching specific entries, looking for someone. Miss Weatherby, unable to resist demonstrating her postal knowledge, added primly, Mr. Vale asked me last week about irregular unions in our records. I found his smile rather unpleasant when I directed him to the clergy. Dr. Haydock nodded grimly. He'd been asking me about the late Mrs. Thornley's family genealogies as well, particularly interested in an inheritance dispute from decades past, a distant cousin who disappeared under mysterious circumstances, leaving considerable property. The investigation was broadening beyond Peter Clement's personal troubles to encompass generations of village secrets. Miss Marple observed how Mrs. Pike's eyes flickered toward the marriage register with something that might have been fear, while Sally Clement's protective stance seemed to intensify. So we have blackmail on multiple fronts, Inspector Slack muttered, his earlier certainty about Peter wavering. Financial improprieties, family scandals, inheritance, disputus. Half the village could have wanted Vale silenced. Miss Marple stepped closer to the lectern, her keen eyes taking in the constellation of blood droplets on the sacred page, not smeared, but flicked deliberately, as if someone had shaken the weapon clean. The sandy grit near the chancel steps suggested smooth-soled shoes, not the crepe soles favored by most villagers. Such careful staging, she murmured. Someone wanted us to see exactly what they wished us to see, and nothing more. Inspector Slack looked around the ancient church with growing frustration. The obvious suspect was proving inconveniently complicated, and Little Wickham's peaceful facade was revealing depths he hadn't anticipated. Inspector Slack's determination to unravel Little Wickham's secrets led the small party to Vale's mill house as shadows lengthened across the village. The Tudor structure stood isolated beyond the stream, its mullioned windows reflecting the dying afternoon light with an almost watchful quality. Miss Marple accompanied the group with her characteristic gentle persistence, ostensibly interested in the late roses climbing the cottage walls, but observing everything with her sharp blue eyes. The front door yielded to Inspector Slack's authoritative knock, revealing Vale's methodical nature immediately. His study was a testament to organized investigation, filing cabinets labeled by family surnames, correspondence sorted chronologically, and genealogical charts that mapped Little Wickham's bloodlines with surgical precision. The desk bore the organized chaos of a man who treated secrets as currency, with notebooks, magnifying glasses, and carefully catalogued photographs arranged in neat stacks. Good heavens! Dr. Haydock muttered, examining a folder marked Irregular Unions, 1,890 to 1,920. He's documented every family skeleton in the village, illegitimate births, suspicious inheritances, medical irregularities. It's all systematically recorded. Miss Marple drifted toward Vale's desk where his current project lay spread before them. A leather-bound ledger contained names paired with monetary figures and dates. Some entries crossed through with satisfied finality, while others bore ominous question marks. The amounts were modest by London standards, but significant enough to cause genuine distress in a village where respectability mattered more than wealth. Monthly payments, Inspector Slack observed grimly, running his finger down the columns. He wasn't greedy, just persistent. Small amounts that people could manage without arousing suspicion from their families. Thornley's historical documents in a locked cabinet, birth certificates, marriage records, wills, and correspondence spanning generations. Among them, Miss Marple noticed a partially completed family tree with several names connected by dotted lines and question marks, suggesting Vale had been tracing bloodlines through multiple generations. He was particularly interested in inheritance disputes, she observed quietly, examining a folder of legal correspondence. Several families seemed to have had property questions dating back decades. Dr. Haydock found Vale's medical inquiries documented with disturbing thoroughness, questions about family histories, causes of death, and genetic irregularities that could suggest illegitimate relationships or hidden scandals. The man had clearly understood that a village doctor possessed secrets that could prove extremely valuable to someone with blackmail in mind. Inspector Slack discovered Vale's correspondence with the London solicitors, revealing the registered packets contained regular reports on his investigations. The final letter, dated the previous week, indicated Vale believed he was close to exposing something significant, something that would conclude the Wickham matter permanently and profitably. Miss Marple examined a small notebook where Vale had jotted observations about villagers' daily routines, their relationships, and their vulnerabilities. Peter Clement appeared frequently, but so did Mrs. Pike, Miss Weatherby, and even Reverend Ashworth. Vale had been casting a wide net, gathering leverage over anyone who might prove useful. "The theatrical nature of the murder troubles me," Miss Marple said softly, studying Vale's meticulous notes. Someone wanted to create maximum shock and confusion, drawing attention to the crime while simultaneously obscuring the true motive. They found evidence of Vale's recent activities, polishing cloths that matched those in the church vestry, a spare key that could fit the church locks, and most intriguingly, a detailed sketch of the church interior with the lectern and altar clearly marked. Someone had planned the crime staging with considerable care. As they prepared to leave the mill house, Inspector Slack reflected that Vale's systematic blackmail had created a web of potential murderers. Nearly every family in Little Wickham appeared in his files, each harboring secrets that could destroy reputations or reveal uncomfortable truths about parentage, finances, or past indiscretions. Miss Marple paused at the threshold, her keen eyes taking in the cottage garden where late chrysanthemums bloomed in carefully tended beds. The same yellow pollen that had stained the church ribbon clung to her gloves, a small detail that connected the crime scene to this peaceful place, where a predator had catalogued his prey with scientific precision. "Such methodical cruelty," she murmured as they walked back toward the village. But murder requires passion as well as planning. Someone's desperation finally overcame their fear. The twilight shadows were lengthening across Little Wickham when Miss Weatherby came hurrying toward them from the direction of the post office, her usually immaculate appearance disheveled, and her face bearing the stricken expression of someone whose professional world had been violated. Inspector Slack, recognizing the urgency in her approach, halted the small procession, returning from Vale's mill house. "Inspector," she called breathlessly, "there's been a theft at the post office. That registered packet Mr. Vale posted yesterday, it's gone from the safe." The effect was immediate and electric. Inspector Slack's notebook appeared in his hand with practiced speed. "When did you discover this?" "Just now, when I went to reconcile the weekend receipts," Miss Weatherby replied, her voice trembling with professional indignation. "The packet was secure when I locked up at 7 o'clock yesterday evening. I checked twice, as I always do with registered items. But when I opened the safe 20 minutes ago, it had simply vanished." Miss Marple observed the postmistress with quiet interest, noting how the woman's hands smoothed her skirts with nervous repetition and how her usual crisp efficiency had given way to genuine distress. More intriguingly, she noticed the faint dusting of yellow pollen on Miss Weatherby's dark sleeve, the same chrysanthemum pollen that had stained the torn ribbon in the church. The safe showed no signs of tampering, Miss Weatherby continued as they hurried toward the post office. "It's a Chubb lock, Inspector, reliable as the Bank of England. Only myself and Percy Dodd have keys, and Percy's been abed with influenza since Friday." The post office, with its familiar smell of sealing wax and official forms, felt different now violated. The black safe squatted in the corner like an accusation, its door properly locked but its contents compromised. Inspector Slack examined the mechanism thoroughly, finding no scratches or signs of forced entry. "Show me the ledger," he commanded. Miss Weatherby produced the registration book with shaking hands. Vale's angular signature was clearly visible, along with the destination, Hartwell and Associates. Lincoln's Inn. Miss Marple drifted closer, ostensibly to admire the neat penmanship. But her keen eyes took in the faint traces of sandy grit along the safe's interior edge, the same fine particles Dr. Haydock had noted in the church chancel. "Who else knew about this particular packet?" Inspector Slack asked. Miss Weatherby's professional pride warred with her obvious distress. "Only Mr. Vale and myself, of course. Though," she hesitated, "Mrs. Pike was at the counter when I was logging the entry. The bell rang, and I stepped away for a moment to serve her. She was posting a letter to her sister and purchasing stamps." Dr. Haydock, who had been examining the safe with clinical attention, pointed to a small detail that had escaped notice. "There's beeswax residue on the lock mechanism, Inspector. Fresh, by the look of it. The same sort used for polishing church candlesticks." This observation sent a chill through the small group. The connection between the church murder scene and the post office theft was becoming undeniably clear. Someone had moved between both locations with purpose and preparation. Inspector Slack telephoned Hartwell and Associates immediately, his conversation brief but revealing. When he returned, his expression was grim. They were expecting documentation regarding irregular marriage proofs affecting property inheritance in the Wickham district. Vale had scheduled an appointment for Tuesday to deliver what he called conclusive evidence. Then the stolen packet contained preliminary proof, Miss Marple observed gently, her knitting needles resuming their quiet rhythm. "Enough to frighten someone desperately, but not enough to complete the exposure, rather like showing someone the noose before tightening it." Reverend Ashworth, who had remained silent throughout the revelations, suddenly spoke with obvious reluctance. "I should mention, Inspector, that I saw Mr. Vale returning to the church yesterday evening around 6:30. He crossed the green carrying what appeared to be a leather satchel. I assumed he meant to make final preparations for his proposed exhibition. The pieces were falling into place with disturbing clarity. Vale had returned to the church with additional evidence. Someone had followed him there, and the same person had subsequently stolen his correspondence to prevent its delivery to London. The killer was still active, still desperate, and still dangerous. The urgency of locating Vale's missing documentation drove Inspector Slack back to Street Bartholomew's as dusk settled over Little Wickham. The ancient church felt different now, its familiar sanctuary transformed into a repository of secrets that stretched back generations. Miss Marple accompanied the search party with her characteristic quiet persistence, her keen eyes already noting subtle changes in the building's atmosphere since their earlier investigation. "The satchel must be here somewhere," Inspector Slack muttered, directing Constable Pierce toward the transept while he examined the vestry more thoroughly. Vale returned with it yesterday evening, and the killer wouldn't have risked carrying it through the village. Miss Marple drifted toward the organ, her attention drawn to the bellows mechanism, where dust patterns suggested recent disturbance. "Inspector," she called softly, "I believe we should examine this area more carefully." Behind the organ's ancient machinery, wedged between wooden supports and partially crushed by the bellows' mechanical action, they discovered Vale's leather satchel. The contents had scattered during the instrument's operation, creating a paper trail of devastating evidence across the dusty floor. Dr. Haydock gathered the documents with growing amazement. "Good heavens, he's documented a systematic fraud spanning decades. Look at this: falsified marriage certificates, altered wills, forged birth records. Someone has been manipulating inheritance claims throughout the district with remarkable sophistication." The genealogical charts revealed Vale's methodical investigation into what he had termed the Wickham deception. Multiple families showed suspicious gaps in their documented histories, with property transfers that defied logical inheritance patterns. Most significantly, the papers detailed irregularities surrounding the Wickham Trust properties, 3 cottages on Forge Lane, and valuable meadow rents that had been administered by the parish council for over 40 years. Inspector Slack examined a photograph of a parish register entry with obvious alterations. The original names have been scraped away and rewritten. This marriage certificate from 1903 shows signs of deliberate forgery, but executed so skillfully that casual examination would never detect it. Miss Marple studied a bundle of letters tied with blue silk ribbon, the same material that had been torn at the crime scene. Vale's correspondence revealed his growing certainty about someone he referred to as the architect of decades of calculated deception. His final, unsent letter to the London solicitors contained a name that made several people in their small group draw sharp breaths. "Mrs. Pike," Inspector Slack read aloud from Vale's notes, "has served as committee chair for the Wickham Trust properties for 12 years. Her intimate knowledge of local genealogies and access to parish records would have provided unlimited opportunities for document manipulation." When confronted with this evidence, Mrs. Pike's carefully maintained composure finally cracked. Her gloved hands trembled as she examined the photograph of the altered marriage certificate. "I was protecting people," she said in a whisper that shocked even herself. The original entry would have legitimized a child everyone believed illegitimate. It would have destroyed settled arrangements, thrown families from their homes. "Miss Marple," observed Mrs. Pike's reaction with quiet understanding. "But Mr. Vale discovered the truth, didn't he? That what you thought was kindness had actually denied rightful inheritance to legitimate heirs." The implications were staggering. The irregular child from 1903 would have had descendants with legal claims to properties that had supported other families for generations. Vale's threatened exposure would have triggered legal challenges affecting half the village. As they gathered the scattered evidence, Miss Marple noticed fresh beeswax residue on several documents and faint traces of the same sandy grit they had found throughout their investigation. Someone had returned to the church after the murder, searching desperately for these papers before the organ's mechanism scattered them beyond easy retrieval. The killer came back, she observed softly, but found the evidence already disturbed. Someone is still very much afraid of what Mr. Vale discovered about the true ownership of Little Wickham's most valuable properties. Mrs. Pike's admission about protecting people hung in the ancient air of Street Bartholomew's like a confession seeking absolution, but Miss Marple's keen blue eyes detected something incomplete in the woman's carefully chosen words. The scattered papers from Vale's satchel told a more complex story than simple neighborhood kindness, and the elderly spinster sensed that the true heart of this tragedy lay deeper than document fraud, however systematic. Miss Marple said gently, settling herself more comfortably on a nearby pew with the deliberate movements of someone preparing for a thorough conversation. "You've spoken of protecting others, but I wonder if you might tell us about the burden you've carried all these years." The question struck with surgical precision. Mrs. Pike's hands stilled in their nervous smoothing of her gloves, and her carefully maintained composure wavered like candlelight in a draught. For the first time since the investigation began, she appeared genuinely vulnerable rather than merely defensive. Inspector Slack, recognizing the delicate moment, remained silent, while Miss Marple continued with her characteristic blend of kindness and relentless logic. "You see, my dear, the pattern of alterations Mr. Vale discovered suggests someone with intimate knowledge spanning generations. Someone who understood not just individual family secrets, but how they interconnected across decades." Dr. Haydock examined one of the altered marriage certificates more closely, his medical training lending precision to his observations. The ink variations suggest these changes were made over many years, not all at once. Someone was maintaining an elaborate deception across multiple generations. Mrs. Pike's resistance finally crumbled entirely. "My father," she whispered, the words barely audible in the vast space. "My father was the illegitimate child recorded in that 1903 register. When I was young and foolish, barely 20, I altered the entry to legitimize his birth. I thought it would give our family respectability, remove the shame that had followed us." The confession tumbled out with the relief of a burden too long carried. Once she had made that initial alteration, Mrs. Pike discovered that legitimizing her father created a chain of inheritance claims that threatened to uproot multiple families from their homes. The Wickham Trust properties, administered through carefully maintained genealogies, would have reverted to different bloodlines entirely. "To protect innocent families from the consequences of my youthful vanity," she continued, her voice gaining strength, "I began making other adjustments. Small changes to birth dates, subtle alterations to marriage records, careful modifications that preserved the status quo while hiding my original deception." Miss Marple studied the scattered documents thoughtfully, her knitting needles resuming their quiet rhythm. "But Mr. Vale threatened to expose everything, didn't he? Not just the original alteration, but the entire web you'd created to maintain it. He would have destroyed so many lives," Mrs. Pike said desperately. 3 families would lose their homes. Children would discover their inheritance was built on fraud. The scandal would have torn Little Wickham apart. But as Miss Marple examined the papers more carefully, her attention was drawn to details that troubled her deeply. The theatrical staging of Vale's murder, the deliberate defilement of the sacred text, the careful positioning of the body, all suggested a mind quite different from Mrs. Pike's methodical document manipulation. "Mrs. Pike," she said quietly, "your decades of careful alterations provide a motive for wanting Mr. Vale silenced. But they don't explain the particular way he was killed. The blood on the Bible, the dramatic positioning, the symbolic desecration, these speak of a different kind of desperation entirely." Miss Marple rose and drifted toward the lectern where the blood-stained Bible had been discovered. "It reminds me of a situation in Street. Mary Mead," she continued, her tone becoming more anecdotal, where a seemingly passionate crime was actually a carefully calculated attempt to retrieve incriminating evidence. The perpetrator, in their haste to appear emotional and uncontrolled, left behind very precise clues that revealed their methodical nature. Her mild blue eyes surveyed the small group, still gathered in the vestry. "Here, we have chrysanthemum pollen found both at the crime scene and elsewhere, beeswax residue connecting the church to the post office, and evidence of someone moving between both locations with remarkable precision. These details suggest someone whose professional life revolves around order, accuracy, and the careful handling of important documents." Miss Marple's gaze settled gently on Miss Weatherby, who had been listening with her usual rigid attention, but now appeared increasingly uncomfortable. Someone who would find Mr. Vale's threatened exposure of systematic fraud utterly intolerable. Not because of personal involvement, but because such chaos would destroy the ordered world they had spent their career maintaining. Miss Weatherby's face had gone pale, and she unconsciously brushed at her sleeve, where traces of yellow pollen still clung to the dark fabric. Her usual professional composure was cracking, revealing something that looked suspiciously like panic beneath her carefully maintained exterior. "The person who killed Mr. Vale," Miss Marple concluded softly, "was someone who prized precision above all else. Someone who couldn't bear the thought of Little Wickham's carefully maintained records being exposed as fraudulent, not because they had committed the fraud, but because such revelation would represent the complete failure of everything they held sacred about proper documentation and official accuracy." The silence in the vestry was absolute, broken only by the distant sound of evening birds in the churchyard. Miss Weatherby's breath hitched audibly, and her hands trembled as she gripped her handbag with white-knuckled intensity. The mask of professional neutrality she had worn throughout the investigation was finally slipping, revealing the desperate fear of someone whose entire world was built on the sanctity of proper records and official truth. Miss Marple waited with the infinite patience of someone who understood that the human heart, when finally cornered, would always reveal its secrets in its own time. Miss Weatherby's rigid composure cracked like fine porcelain under pressure, her hands trembling as she smoothed her dark skirts with the mechanical precision of someone whose world had suddenly tilted beyond recognition. The accumulated weight of Miss Marple's gentle observations, the chrysanthemum pollen, the beeswax residue, the sandy grit connecting crime scenes, had created an inexorable web of evidence that even the most meticulous postmistress could not explain away. "You must understand," Miss Weatherby whispered, her voice carrying the brittle quality of someone whose fundamental beliefs had been shattered. 37 years I've maintained perfect records. Every stamp accounted for, every registered item tracked with absolute precision. My reputation was built on accuracy, on the sacred trust of official documentation." Miss Marple nodded with infinite gentleness, recognizing the tragedy of a life devoted to order, confronted with systematic chaos. "And Mr. Vale threatened to expose fraud in the very records you had sworn to protect. The marriage certificates, birth documents, property transfers, all bearing evidence of alterations that had passed through your hands without detection." Inspector Slack leaned forward, but Miss Marple's subtle gesture counseled patience. The confession was emerging naturally, like water finding its inevitable course, and harsh official pressure would only drive it back underground. "When he brought those documents Saturday evening to compare with our files," Miss Weatherby continued, her professional mask dissolving entirely, "I realized immediately what Mrs. Pike had accomplished over the decades. The subtle changes, the careful alterations, they were all there in our official records because I had processed them without question, trusting in their authenticity." Dr. Haydock observed the postmistress with clinical interest, noting the signs of someone whose rigid mental framework was collapsing under intolerable pressure. Her entire identity had been constructed around professional competence, and Vale's discoveries threatened to reveal her as an unwitting accomplice to systematic deception. He was so arrogant, Miss Weatherby said, her voice hardening with remembered fury, standing in the vestry with his magnifying glass, comparing our official records to his discoveries, making notes about postal negligence and systematic fraud. He actually smiled when he told me that my professional incompetence would make excellent evidence in his London testimony. The pieces fell into place with tragic clarity. Miss Weatherby's access to church keys through her position as parish treasurer, her intimate knowledge of postal procedures, her horror at the threatened exposure of decades of fraudulent documentation, all had combined to create the perfect storm of desperate action. "You followed him to the church," Miss Marple said softly, knowing about the spare vestry key, understanding that confrontation in sacred space might seem less suspicious than a public meeting. Miss Weatherby nodded with mechanical precision. "I had to make him understand the consequences, the chaos his revelations would create, the destruction of carefully maintained records, the scandal that would engulf innocent families. But he laughed at me, called me a fussy old spinster who didn't understand the real world." "So you struck him with the candlestick," Inspector Slack observed, and his notebook ready but his tone carefully neutral. "It wasn't planned," she said desperately. "But when he fell and the blood splattered across the open Bible, I saw it as fitting. The defilement of sacred text mirroring the defilement of all our records. I arranged everything to reflect that symbolism while I searched for his evidence." Miss Marple studied the scattered papers thoughtfully. "But you couldn't locate his satchel that first night, so you returned Sunday morning, using the organ to mask your search sounds." "I played Abide With Me," Miss Weatherby whispered. "It seemed appropriate while I looked for the documents that would destroy everything I'd worked to maintain." The final admission hung in the ancient air like a prayer seeking absolution. Inspector Slack closed his notebook with quiet authority, while Miss Marple reflected that even the most ordered minds could be driven to chaos when their fundamental certainties were threatened. In trying to preserve the illusion of perfect records, Miss Weatherby had committed the ultimate disorder murder in God's house, with consequences that would haunt Little Wickham far longer than any administrative scandal. The formal arrest proceeded with the quiet dignity that seemed fitting for someone whose entire career had been built on proper procedures, even as those very procedures now turned inexorably against her. Miss Weatherby submitted to Inspector Slack's official caution with the same composed efficiency she had brought to 37 years of postal service, her hands steady as the handcuffs clicked into place with mechanical precision. "I shall need to retrieve the packet first," she said with professional clarity, directing them back toward the post office. "It's beneath the till drawer. There's a sliding panel I had fitted years ago for valuable items. I used beeswax on the runner to prevent squeaking." The small procession moved through Little Wickham's darkening streets, past windows beginning to glow with evening light, while curious faces peered from behind lace curtains at the unprecedented sight of their postmistress under arrest. At the post office, Miss Weatherby indicated the hidden compartment with the practiced movements of a lifetime's habit. Constable Pierce retrieved the registered envelope to Lincoln's Inn, its red wax seal still intact. Miss Marple examined the sandy residue near the back door with quiet interest. "Builder's sand," Miss Weatherby explained automatically. "They're fitting new shelves in the storeroom. It tracks everywhere, particularly on smooth-soled shoes." "Indeed it does," Miss Marple agreed gently. "From the church path to the post office and back again. Such a distinctive trail when one knows what to look for. The pattern of evidence tells quite a complete story, you see. The chrysanthemum pollen linking the church decorations to Miss Weatherby's clothing, the beeswax residue connecting the candlestick weapon to the safe mechanism, and this sandy grit tracing her movements between both locations." She paused, her knitting needles resuming their gentle rhythm. But most telling of all was the nature of the crime itself. The blood flicked deliberately across the sacred text, not smeared in panic. The body positioned with careful precision, the torn ribbon cut cleanly with scissors before being frayed to suggest violence, even in extremity. Miss Weatherby maintained her instinctive need for order and accuracy. Mrs. Pike, who had followed them from the church, spoke with visible anguish. "I never intended for my deceptions to lead to this tragedy. When I altered those records as a foolish young woman, I thought I was simply correcting an ancient injustice. Often begins with small compromises that grow larger with each passing year. Your father's legitimacy seemed important then, but maintaining that fiction required ever more elaborate deceptions. Miss Weatherby's entire identity was constructed around professional competence. Vale's threatened exposure would have revealed her as an unwitting accomplice to systematic fraud spanning generations. For someone whose life was built on the sanctity of proper documentation, such revelation would have been utterly devastating. Reverend Ashworth, still bearing traces of the afternoon's shock, addressed the practical concerns with pastoral gravity. The Wickham Trust properties will require careful legal review. Several families may face uncomfortable questions about their inheritance rights, but we must proceed with Christian charity toward all involved. The irony, Miss Marple reflected as they prepared to leave, is that Miss Weatherby's meticulous preservation of evidence, even while committing murder, has provided the very proof needed to expose the fraud she died trying to conceal. Her dedication to accuracy ultimately revealed the deception she could not bear to acknowledge. Peter and Sally Clement approached hesitantly, their earlier terror now replaced by genuine sympathy. "We never realized the pressure she was under," Sally said softly. "She always seemed so completely in control." "Control," Miss Marple replied gently, "is often merely an elaborate illusion. When people build their entire sense of self on external order, they become terribly vulnerable to chaos." As Miss Weatherby was led away to the waiting police vehicle, her professional composure remained intact even in defeat. A final testament to the rigid standards that had both defined and ultimately destroyed her carefully ordered world. The autumn evening settled over Little Wickham with the peculiar quiet that follows great upheavals, as if the village itself were holding its breath while absorbing the magnitude of what had been revealed. Miss Marple walked slowly home from the post office, her keen eyes taking in the subtle changes already visible in her neighbor's demeanor, the way curtains twitched more cautiously, how conversations ceased more abruptly when strangers approached, and the general air of a community that had looked into its own reflection and found it more complex than previously imagined. By the following Tuesday morning, Little Wickham was making its characteristic attempt to restore normalcy, though the effort bore the careful quality of someone mending precious china. The church bell rang for morning service with its usual clarity, but Reverend Ashworth had arranged for the blood-stained Bible to be carefully restored by specialists from the cathedral. The ancient text would bear forever a faint shadow where Vale's blood had fallen, a reminder that even the most sacred spaces were not immune to human frailty and desperation. Dr. Haydock stopped by Miss Marple's cottage that morning, ostensibly to check on her health, but actually seeking the comfort of her steady wisdom. "Remarkable how you saw through the obvious to the truth," he observed, settling into her garden chair with visible relief. "Poor Peter Clement was convinced he'd hang for Vale's murder." Miss Marple poured tea with practiced grace, her movements reflecting the calm that had returned to her demeanor now that justice had been properly served. "People often reveal themselves most clearly when they believe they're being cleverly deceptive, Doctor. Miss Weatherby's need for precision betrayed her, even in murder. The careful staging, the methodical placement of evidence, it was all quite characteristic of someone whose entire life revolved around exact procedures." Inspector Slack had telephoned from Much Benham with news that Hartwell and Associates had confirmed receipt of the recovered packet. The London solicitors would now coordinate with the Charity Commission regarding the Wickham Trust properties, beginning the delicate process of untangling decades of carefully maintained deceptions. The legal review would be thorough but conducted with consideration for current residents, many of whom had lived in their cottages for generations without knowing their tenancy rested on fraudulent documentation. Mrs. Pike had submitted formal resignations from every committee position she had ever held, her letter to Reverend Ashworth bearing the dignified tone of someone accepting full responsibility for actions taken decades earlier with the best of intentions. "I shall cooperate completely with whatever investigations are required," she had written, "but I pray that any necessary corrections be made with gentleness toward the innocent families who may be affected." The Clements had found their personal ordeal concluded with surprising mercy. Inspector Slack, recognizing that Vale's blackmail attempts against them had been based on relatively minor financial irregularities from Peter's previous employment, had recommended no charges be filed. The young couple's relief was palpable as they began to rebuild their reputation in the community, finding that Little Wickham's capacity for forgiveness was stronger than they had dared hope. As Miss Marple sat in her garden that evening, her knitting needles moving with their characteristic gentle rhythm, she reflected on the human capacity for both great kindness and terrible destructiveness, often residing within the same individual. Mrs. Pike's protective alterations had been motivated by genuine love for her father and concern for established families, while Miss Weatherby's murderous actions had stemmed from an equally genuine, if tragically misguided, dedication to professional standards. "The saddest aspect," she murmured to her tabby cat, who had settled purring in her lap, "is how unnecessary it all became." Miss Weatherby's professional reputation would have survived the revelation of Mrs. Pike's deceptions. After all, detecting sophisticated forgeries was never part of her postal duties, but her sense of professional identity had become so rigid that she couldn't distinguish between unwitting involvement and deliberate fraud. The village would heal, as villages do, though it would carry these revelations like carefully mended lace, stronger for the repair, but forever marked by the pattern of its breaking. Mrs. Bantry had already organized a fund for Miss Weatherby's legal representation, demonstrating the complex mixture of horror and compassion that the case had generated among the villagers. Even in their shock, the people of Little Wickham recognized that their postmistress had been driven to desperate action by forces beyond simple malice. Miss Marple gathered her knitting as the first stars appeared above the ancient churchyard. In her long experience, she had learned that the most profound mysteries often lay not in exotic crimes or elaborate schemes, but in the quiet desperation of ordinary people pushed beyond their capacity to cope with life's complexities. The secret of the secret, blood-stained Bible would be remembered not merely as a tale of murder and blackmail, but as a reminder that beneath the peaceful surface of any community lay the eternal human struggles with pride, fear, and the terrible weight of secrets carried too long. The morning sun would rise again over Little Wickham, casting familiar shadows across streets where justice had been served, and mercy would, in time, begin its healing work. In Miss Marple's experience, small communities possessed remarkable resilience, and she had no doubt that her village would endure, scarred but not broken, wiser for having confronted the darker currents that flow beneath even the most tranquil waters. As she latched her garden gate and prepared for bed, Miss Marple reflected that the blood-stained Bible, once restored, would serve its congregation with renewed meaning. Sometimes, she thought, it takes a great shock to remind people that forgiveness and understanding are not merely Sunday virtues, but daily necessities for any community that hopes to remain truly civilized. 3 months had passed since the terrible events at St. Bartholomew's, and Little Wickham had settled into a rhythm that bore the quiet dignity of a community that had faced its darkest secrets and emerged, if not unchanged, then certainly wiser. Miss Marple sat in her customary pew on this crisp December morning, observing the familiar faces around her with the gentle satisfaction of someone who had witnessed justice served and healing begun. The restored Bible lay open on the lectern, its ancient pages bearing only the faintest shadow where tragedy had once marked them. Reverend Ashworth had chosen his text from the Book of Ruth with particular care, speaking of loyalty, redemption, and the complex paths that lead people toward truth. His congregation listened with the attentiveness of those who had learned that even their peaceful village was not immune to the darker currents of human nature. Mrs. Pike occupied her usual front pew, though her bearing had changed considerably. The legal proceedings regarding the Wickham Trust properties had concluded with remarkable gentleness. The Charity Commission had ruled that current residents could remain in their cottages with proper documentation, while a modest settlement fund would compensate any legitimate claimants discovered through the genealogical review. Her decades of careful alterations had been officially acknowledged as misguided kindness rather than criminal fraud, and the village had gradually accepted her back into its daily rhythms. Peter and Sally Clement had found their place in Little Wickham's social fabric restored and strengthened. The young organist's music had taken on new depth since his ordeal, as if confronting his own vulnerability had freed him to express emotions previously constrained by fear. Sally's protective love for her husband had earned the respect of village matrons, who recognized genuine devotion when they witnessed it. Miss Marple had maintained careful correspondence with Miss Weatherby throughout the former postmistress's trial and imprisonment. The letters, written in the same precise hand that had once processed decades of village mail, revealed a mind slowly coming to terms with the terrible consequences of perfectionism carried too far. In her most recent letter, Miss Weatherby had written about finding peace in the prison library, cataloguing books, a task requiring precision without the terrible weight of public trust. I understand now. Her latest letter had concluded that my dedication to perfect records blinded me to the greater truth that human beings are inherently imperfect creatures, deserving of compassion rather than rigid judgment. Dr. Haydock had stopped by Miss Marple's cottage the previous evening, bringing both professional concern and personal need for her steady wisdom. "Remarkable case," he had observed. "The way perfectly ordinary people can be driven to extraordinary actions when their fundamental beliefs are threatened." Miss Marple had nodded thoughtfully, her knitting needles maintaining their gentle rhythm. "I've often noticed, Doctor, that the most dangerous criminals are not those who embrace evil, but those who convince themselves they're serving a greater good." Miss Weatherby genuinely believed she was protecting the village from chaos. Just as Mrs. Pike had convinced herself that altering records was an act of kindness. As the service concluded and the congregation filed out into the crisp winter air, Miss Marple reflected on the enduring lessons embedded in the tragedy they had all witnessed. The secret of the blood-stained Bible had taught Little Wickham that even the most peaceful communities harbored complex histories, that kindness without wisdom could create unexpected dangers, and that the pursuit of perfection could lead to consequences far more destructive than the imperfections it sought to eliminate. Walking slowly home through streets where gas lamps cast familiar shadows across ancient stones, Miss Marple considered how this case had reinforced her long-held belief that the most profound mysteries of human behavior were often hidden in plain sight, disguised as ordinary virtues carried to extraordinary extremes. The village would endure, as small communities always did, scarred but not broken, wiser for having confronted the darkness that could emerge when good intentions were pursued without the tempering influence of mercy and understanding. The blood-stained Bible, once restored, would serve future generations as a reminder that forgiveness and healing remained possible even after the most terrible revelations. In her long experience, Miss Marple had learned that true wisdom lay not in the pursuit of perfect truth or flawless records, but in the patient understanding that people were complex creatures deserving of justice tempered always by mercy.